Revered and respected by our ancestors for thousands of years, demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, and now at the dawn of a new millennia, they are making their triumphant return. Scientists, researchers, and patients alike are exploring these ancient therapies to heal modern ailments. And we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research, cutting-edge practices, and first-hand experiences from those who have been transformed in body, mind, and spirit by plant medicines from cannabis to psilocybin to ayahuasca and beyond. This is the Plant Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Plant Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we are going to be talking about psychedelics and nature with Dr. Sam Gandy. Dr. Gandy is a lifelong nature lover and has been fortunate enough to conduct ecological field research in various parts of the world. He has a PhD in ecological science, is a researcher and science writer, and has experience working within the psychedelic field as a past scientific assistant to the director of the Beckley Foundation, and currently as a research assistant with the Synthesis Institute and a senior science writer with WavePaths. He is also a collaborator with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, with a research interest in the capacity of psychedelics to influence our connection to nature. Everyone, I think you're going to love this episode. If you're like me, you probably got a little closer to nature during the pandemic because that's essentially the only place we could go. And that feeling you get in nature, that connectedness, if you've done psychedelics, you've probably gotten a glimpse of that as well. And Sam and I talk a lot about that interconnectedness between how psychedelics can improve our relationship to nature and how nature can improve the outcomes that we have with our psychedelic journeys. So I'm very glad that you've tuned in for this episode on a topic that I think you're going to thoroughly enjoy. Now, without further ado, thanks so much for joining us today, Sam.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
I'm really looking forward to getting into this discussion because I think it's coming up more and more in psychedelics is that these are not tools to be used in a vacuum, and that there are other ways that we can use other elements that have a synergy with psychedelics that may make them more effective, as well as there are things that psychedelics can help us with in fostering some new connections in our life. So I'm really excited to get into this nature discussion. So Sam, if we could start by talking a little bit about, your paper deals with synergy between psychedelics and nature relatedness. Can you talk a little bit about what nature relatedness is and some of the benefits of it?
Sure, yeah. I think perhaps my favorite kind of, I guess, scientific definition that I've seen of it is nature relatedness or nature connectedness. So there's sort of, interchangeable terms. It's an assessment or a measure of your sustained awareness of your interrelatedness with the rest of nature. So your self-identification with nature, the degree to which you see yourself as part of nature or a wider community of the natural world. And yeah, so it's referring to something quite specific there. It's not just the same as sort of just going out into nature, which is obviously great and has numerous major important health benefits of its own, can be a pathway to nature connectedness, but it's quite complex. It's a sort of it's a multi-dimensional construct. So aspects of your cognition, your personality, your emotions, your direct experience synergize to sort of make up your connection to nature. So it's highly personal and subjective and experiential primarily.
And when is that connection, if it forms, when does that connection usually develop?
So childhood is an important time. Childhood encounters with nature and experiences in nature are definitely quite formative for sort of laying down one's nature connectedness sort of later in life. So it's considered kind of partly mutable and partly immutable. So some aspects of it are flexible and malleable and could be changed and enhanced, and others are more sort of deeply set in your psyche and sort of more resistant to change. And it's sort of a bit of a worry now in terms of childhood, is that more and more children these days are either sort of not getting out into nature very much, or they're using a lot of electronic entertainment technology, and that seems to be kind of exacerbating a nature disconnect, or a nature deficit disorder, as some have termed it in our young.
Interesting. Nature deficit disorder. I've never heard that term. Well, speaking of, can you talk a little bit about maybe, and these are kind of two sides of the same coin, but some of the dangers, health dangers, let's say, of being disconnected to nature, and some of the benefits of having a closer relationship with it?
Yes. So nature connectedness or relatedness, it's associated. There's a good body of scientific literature showing that it's very much associated with psychological well-being, and particularly eudaimonic well-being. So there's two types of well-being, as they're sort of termed in the psychology literature. And hedonic well-being is simply feeling good, in the moment, whereas eudaimonic well-being is sort of, it's something a bit more layered, I guess. It's more about sort of living a life of virtues, self-actualization, having a life of meaning and purpose. And nature connectedness is strongly associated with this in particular. And that kind of encompasses other things. So things like vitality, life meaning, life purpose, life satisfaction. Nature connectedness is also negatively correlated with anxiety, and psychological resilience and restoration it's associated with as well. So, there's quite a sort of body of evidence there. But I should also mention that nature connectedness is a mediator for some of the benefits to cognition and mood, obtained from actually spending time in nature, for having contact with nature. And also importantly, nature connectedness is a strong predictor of actually spending time in nature, because of the value of that relationship you have with nature sort of dictates how much you tend to sort of get out into it. And that has itself big health implications and additive benefits.
That's so interesting. So, being nature connected makes you more likely to spend time in nature and to get more out of the time you do spend in nature.
Yes. So it's a big win-win, and like a never important aspect of it that's very relevant to these times we find ourselves in, is that it's a strong psychological predictor of pro-environmental and pro-nature behavior as well. So I see it as a sort of there's a big win-win here, both for the level of the individual and perhaps sort of the wider biosphere level. And and this is all the more important, I think, given that we're widely considered to there seems to be a growing mental health crisis, as some have termed it, in the West, and there's also a kind of global environmental crisis as well. So, and I think disconnection is a sort of lies at the root of both of these things, not just to nature. I don't want to like oversimplify that, but I feel like psychological disconnection in a broader sense from our communities, from our family, sort of that's sort of playing out in the mental health sphere, but also our disconnection from nature. But our disconnection from nature, I do feel, is driving our like the environmental sort of crisis that we face.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you and some of your colleagues wrote this beautiful paper discussing the synergies between nature relatedness and psychedelics. And so I would love to get into some of the details. And if we could start by talking a little bit about some of the overlaps between those two areas. And you had broken them down into 7 different areas. So I'm going to kind of flow with those if that works. So you
Cool.
started by talking about some of the neurobiological overlaps between nature relatedness and psychedelics.
Yes. So an important one here is that, say, something like psilocybin, a dose of psilocybin and time in nature both reduce rumination. And this is important. This has important mental health implications. So rumination is obviously that looping negative cyclic um, thought one associates with depression. Sort of that little narrating in a voice that you're not good enough, and that's its rumination is both associated with major depression, but it also predicts its occurrence as well. It's also associated with anxiety conditions and persistent post-traumatic stress disorder. So it has big sort of clinical relevance, and it seems both spending time in nature and psilocybin experience both seem to sort of dampen down that, and that might be because the default mode network of the brain is being sort of slightly powered down by those two seemingly very different things. As well, it seems that we know from the brain imaging research, particularly some that Imperial's been involved in, as to what happens to the brain under a psychedelic. And like one of the key things, and this happens with LSD and psilocybin actually, so we can consider it a kind of core psychedelic trait, is that the global connectivity of the brain increases. So within network, on local levels within the brain, that connectivity goes down, but as a global whole, the connectivity increases. So essentially different parts of the brain all start kind of linking up as they wouldn't normally do and start communicating with each other in a kind of more dynamic, unconstrained state of consciousness. And that seems to happen to some degree being in nature. There seems to be this increase again in functional global connectivity of the brain. So there's some of the interesting neurobiological overlaps, but I think it's the psychological overlaps that are sort of
Yes, please get into those.
more compelling. Well, so it's interesting to note that simply taking time to acknowledge nature has been implicated in increasing connectedness. And I don't mean just to it, I mean connectedness in a broad sense. So connectedness to oneself, connectedness to other people, like social connectedness, and then, yes, connectedness to world and nature as well. So, simply taking the time to sort of acknowledge nature is a pathway to deeper connectedness and in a broad sense. And we know that from the psychedelic research on psilocybin now, when it's used in a therapeutic context. One of the things that people say who've had some psilocybin therapy for depression is that there's this shift from a state of disconnection in a broad sense to a move towards greater connectedness. So that's a sort of important shift that happens there that has sort of big mental health implications. As well, one important property that both psychedelic experience and nature both share is the experience of awe. And that's, and sort of awe can be considered, it's the sense of being diminished in the presence of something much greater than yourself, commonly associated with experiencing novelty. And awe is a very interesting and complex emotion, and it seems to be work like a kind of social connective emotion. By feeling sort of smaller, it seems to produce this pro-social effect where you tend to prioritize your awareness outside of yourself. And this is something you can experience encountering fractals in nature, storms, vistas, mountains, and at the same time, yes, it seems to be a core part of the psychedelic state and the mystical experience that psychedelics can occasion. So that's a sort of curious overlap too, and it's sort of like, I guess we'll touch on how you could maybe bring in more awe, depending on the setting. So negative affect as well. So propensity towards negative mood states. We know that psychedelics can, even if not acutely, like some people within a psychedelic experience can definitely have challenging and negative mind states, but usually sort of coming out the other end of that, there's this sort of buffering against sort of negative predisposition to negative mind states. And nature, being in nature, having contact with nature is also a powerful buffer against propensity towards negative affect. What else have
I'm
we got
watching you try
there?
to like recall these in your head. I've totally got them written down. How about mindfulness, Sam?
Oh yes. So yeah, mindfulness is an interesting one. So essentially, yeah, nature-based settings themselves. So going out into nature, it tends to be effortlessly mindful being in nature. So obviously, if you're doing meditation, you'll use your breath or a mantra or something as a kind of awareness anchor. um, and then if your thoughts stray or your awareness strays, you just gently bring it back to whatever it is that anchor. But when you're out in nature, your brain is, rather than having to use one of those things, you're taking in all that sensory input, and it's always changing. Nature is very dynamic, and your brain can't help but be sort of engage with the sort of sensory input that's going on, and it kind of puts it into a present moment focus. And mindfulness, that sort of state of being, also has kind of clinical implications for depression and anxiety. Nature connectedness itself, as an aside from nature contact with nature-based settings, is also associated with um, um, what have I just said? Nature connectedness
Mindfulness.
and mindfulness. Yeah, they're interrelated and synergistic. They seem to have a reciprocal relationship. So if you increase one of them, you tend to increase the other. So yeah, there's an interesting interplay of the two things there. Um, Mystical experiences, and so while mystical experiences outside of a psychedelic context tend to occur fairly infrequently, although sort of a lot of the population has had these experiences. I think I read something today about 30% of people in the US and the UK in the general population report having had mystical experiences. So about one in three of us actually. But they can be quite sporadic as to when and how they occur. But definitely, there's good evidence to show that nature is definitely can elicit mystical and transcendent experiences. And as well, interestingly, it goes the other way. There was a study published last year by a Finnish research group, and one of the most common after effects of a psychedelic mystical experience they found was this sustained positive shift in people's relationship to nature, as well. um yeah.
How about my favorite on and that appeared to be last on the list was because there's so many different elements of this, but how they can both affect personality.
So it's interesting to note that psilocybin went through the mystical experiences that it can occasion, particularly complete mystical experiences that sort of rate highly on the scales used to assess them. They can cause this long-term shift in personality trait openness to experience, and that sort of encompasses things such as hunger for knowledge and curiosity, imagination, appreciating the views of others. Um, and it's also, of all the sort of big five personality traits, it's strongly associated with nature connectedness and also kind of pro-environmental awareness and attitudes as well. Um, at the same time, it's also associated with aesthetic experiencing. So and sensitivity and appreciation for aesthetics, and I think that's important. And this is something that's been noted in the qualitative studies on people who've had psilocybin therapy. Is a common after effect, like a prolonged after effect, is people, yeah, become more appreciative and aware of aesthetics. So they might have a more of an artistic appreciation than they maybe did. But this aesthetic appreciation, particularly when it's directed at nature, when it's centered on nature, the appreciation for beauty in nature is a powerful pathway to it. So I think that's an important facet of this change, is becoming more sensitive and aware to aesthetics in nature. At the same time, a psilocybin mystical experience can um, reduce neuroticism as well, and this has huge health implications. Of all the big five personality traits, like high neuroticism is correlated with many mental and physical um, illnesses. So the capacity for psilocybin and actually ayahuasca as well to reduce neuroticism is really something. Um, but high neuroticism buffers you against some of the benefits you obtain from spending time in nature. So that's important as well. And an interesting thing as well, and we've maybe found it in some research that I've been a part of that I can't talk too much about because it's kind of not been published yet, unfortunately. But in a recent study published from last year, there was this increase in trait absorption was found. So absorption is similar to, it's strongly associated with openness to experience, and it's your capacity to become engrossed and absorbed by internal or external sensory phenomena, and it's strongly predictive of. It's one of the strongest predictors of mystical experiences under psychedelic. So after dosage of psychedelic, absorption is the next strongest predictor of mystical experiences and just generally of spiritual experiences and altered states experiences. And so it's quite interesting. Psilocybin can increase this for at least a month after usage, and that also might have implications for one's relationship to nature and your ability to kind of, or desire to sort of become engrossed and captivated by it.
Interesting. Okay, well, we will definitely be on the lookout for your upcoming paper that discusses that. Let's now move to discussing how we can use these two things in synergy with each other. So let's start by talking about how to maximize nature relatedness using psychedelics.
So yeah, at this time, there's been a few survey studies looking at psychedelic use and nature relatedness. There's been one small study from Imperial using a subsample of people who've had psilocybin therapy for depression. So it's either been kind of naturalistic usage where we don't really know the context to much degree that people have been using the psychedelics, or it's been in a clinical setting, including the research that I've been involved in recently. And what's really interesting is that psilocybin has this capacity to facilitate this kind of fairly robust, rapid, but most importantly, sustained increase in nature relatedness. And the really mysterious and interesting thing is that it can do this even when um, it's administered in a clinical setting, where there's no sort of, I guess, nature in the form of non-human life around. And all the other sort of nature connectedness enhancing interventions that are in the literature, so things like wilderness or nature immersion retreats, nature-based educational programs that encourage daily active engagement with nature. Unsurprisingly, nature is very much the central focus there of all these things. Whereas psilocybin can bring about this shift blindly, like without any intent to increase it, and without a nature based context as well. So that's really interesting and mysterious. There's nothing else in the literature that I'm aware of that kind of comes close to that. It suggests that just as an intrinsic part of their effect, um, psychedelics such as at least psilocybin is a nature connecting agent. So it makes me wonder, well, that's great and fantastic, but like imagine if we actually use these things intentionally as nature connecting agents. And there are a number of different ways we could potentially go about this. I mean, at least here at this time in the UK, the laws and regulations kind of pertaining to clinical usage of psilocybin are very strict. Like you can't take people outside of a kind of monitored, licensed research hospital setting. So there's no opportunity really for taking people out into nature. So if you can't take people out into nature, then perhaps you can kind of bring some nature into the clinic. At the very least, some art and photography. And there's been studies that even sort of having that in one's vicinity can have psychologically soothing effects. And as well, like the study that I helped set up a study room at Imperial College, and that was in a hospital environment, and it was for immunocompromised patients, was its sort of day-to-day use. So there was very strict rules about anything being in there that wasn't human, essentially. And we tried to make it as nice as I felt like we made a nice job in terms of we put nice woodland like screens depicting woodland garden settings all around the room. We draped the hospital monitoring equipment. I put some Himalayan salt lamps in. So at the end, it was a nice, cozy environment for people to have those experiences. But I feel like there's a lot more we could be doing potentially. So we could be bringing in nature at various different phases, not necessarily during the session itself, but as part of the preparation and the integration phases. So the practice of Japanese forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku, is essentially an active mindfulness practice taking place in a woodland setting. And I feel like that could be a really nice practice to sort of bring in for people, particularly perhaps in the integration stage where people are still a bit open, perhaps a little bit raw, because it kind of gets you to sort of slow down and tune into your various senses and tune into nature. And it's a fun, easy, non-threatening practice. As well, there's also the potential of awe walks. So there was a study published last year looking at this really quite simple but quite powerful intervention where people essentially went on a 15-minute walk once a week for 8 weeks. That was the study time frame. And they were simply briefed before going on this walk to tap into their childlike sense of wonder at the world and seek out experiences of awe. And what they found over the study time frame is that when people did these walks, only 15-minute walk a week, just being sort of mindful and aware, but people's pro-social kind of emotions and feelings increased, their mental distress went down, but they actually experienced more awe the more they kind of looked for it as well, interestingly. And we know that so awe is associated quite strongly with absorption. So your ability to become absorbed in things like that sort of influences awe. And we already know that absorption can persist beyond a psilocybin experience. But we also interestingly know that the same thing can happen with awe. Post psychedelic experience, as well as the experience itself being one of awe, people seem to become more awe sensitive following that experience. So I feel like there's more we could be doing with that. And as nature is like the typical trigger of awe. So I feel like there's a nice sort of potential synergy that could be used there. Simply barefoot walking in nature, that's been shown to increase nature connectedness, at least kind of in the moment. So one of the pathways to nature connectedness is sensory contact with nature. So what you can, like smelling the flowers, hearing the bird song, seeing the sunlight coming through the trees. But if you think about it, having bare feet, you're sort of, and being on the earth, you kind of plugged into it through a different set of senses that you're not normally. So that's sort of a kind of low tech way of doing it. If you want to go whole hog and to the max, you could potentially build or construct sort of psychedelic ecotherapy nature connection centers somewhere in nature that's stunning. I would imagine somewhere that's got a mix of, say, woodland and coastal. I remember being on the coast of British Columbia in Canada on Vancouver Island, somewhere like that, with fantastic, like big, massive old growth trees, and then amazing coastal vistas as well. So you've got a mix of amazing restorative natural environments there. Build the center itself could be constructed for using biophilic design. So actually infusing nature, imbuing it into the structure itself. You can have big windows, skylights, so people can see the vistas, see the trees, essentially see the stars, and that can be sort of that can be titrated kind of depending on the needs and wants of the person having that session. So the guide or whoever's sort of kind of overseeing the session can modify that depending on what's wanted. And then as well, a simple thing of the potential for psychedelic outdoor therapy. So some people, there's sort of a growing interest in having therapy outdoors, and it has a number of potential benefits in that it shifts the client, so that the patient therapist relationship. So in a clinical setting, which is kind of the habitat of the therapist, there's this power dynamic there, whereas in nature kind of is neutral ground, so it shifts the sort of dynamic there of that relationship. And then the restorative effect of nature obviously benefits both the person having the therapy and the therapists, and it potentially allows for the outdoor nature-based setting to become part of the therapy itself, and a connection might form where the person having the therapy can then return to that setting and use it to self-soothe outside of the therapeutic context. And given what we know about psychedelics actively facilitating this connection to nature, it seems like they could be useful kind of agents here. And like perhaps you wouldn't maybe have a full dose, but say a sort of more modest dose with a therapist or team of therapists somewhere out in nature, walking somewhere. It's quite a radical departure from the current clinical psychedelic model, but I don't know. I feel like there could be some potential there. It would be great, I think, to see more. I've heard ecotherapy described as essentially facilitating a connection between humans and nature to bring about physical mental healing. And that's what psychedelics like psilocybin do. They are powerful catalysts of connection. The context in which they use is very important for determining the benefits and the outcomes. So it seems to me that if something at all such as psilocybin was used with an eco-therapeutic intent and in that kind of context, they could potentially be really helpful.
I can imagine. I love the whole hog version as you described. That's fantastic. And I'm picturing somebody because I have a dear friend who, Ian Michael, who's making sites in Costa Rica, and I think there's
Mm.
another one in Canada, and so I think a lot of people are actually putting an eye toward those. What was the type of construction you called it?
Biophilic design.
Yes, biophilic
Um,
design.
so actually incorporating elements of nature into the architecture of the structures.
I like that
Um,
because I always think about the benefits of nature during journeys, but also protecting people from some of the elements. I've done
mm.
outside middle of the jungle
Yeah,
ayahuasca ceremonies, and all of a sudden there's a rooster in my face. Like there's some kind of level of how can we incorporate nature, but still, like you said, is there a ceiling where they can see through and they can see the sky? But if it pours down rain, they're not suddenly inundated with
yes.
that kind of thing.
No, that this is it's an important point actually. That you know if we're going to kind of potentially use nature-based settings, particularly for like an acute experience, like it definitely requires some thought and some planning, because the great thing about the clinical setting is that it's safe and secure and controlled, entirely. I mean, and it's internal as well. People are wearing headphones with a playlist. They're wearing eye shades. They've been kind of briefed to kind of go inside and basically do some psychological spring cleaning and light shining, and so it's a very the kind of the setting is internal essentially for the most part. And that sort of that setting, so the clinical space is essentially a container of safety. Nature is inherently uncontrollable and unpredictable. There are variables beyond your control. the weather may change. There may be wildlife like mosquitoes or something getting up in your grill, or that the rooster, as you mentioned, that you may bump into people, into strangers. So there are safety um, concerns that need to be thought through prior to sort of doing this. But with the kind of forethought, I think there is sort of potential to kind of these kind of issues aren't insurmountable. There are sort of workarounds for all of them. But yes, if you're going to do any kind of like psychedelic nature connection, nature immersion therapy, like very important to have a cozy, secure structure that people have got as a safe place for
Yeah,
whenever
absolutely.
needed.
Well, Sam, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that I should have? Any last thoughts?
I think we've covered some good ground, haven't we?
I believe so. And don't and if we've covered all the ground, just feel free to tell people where they can find your paper and where they can find out more about you if they'd like to follow your research.
Yeah, if people want to kind of delve more into the literature on this topic, um, as Limery mentioned, I've written a review paper with a number of scientific collaborators, including Dr. Ros Watts, who's my second author, and she's unlike me. I'm a researcher. She's a psychedelic therapist, so it was really nice to collaborate and have her kind of wisdom and expertise sort of infuse the paper. But yeah, the paper's called "The Potential Synergistic Effects Between Psychedelic Administration and Nature Contact for the Improvement of Mental Health." And that's open access and just sort of out there.
And we will definitely link to that
Um,
in our show notes.
cool. And this is I should add, this is a kind of a newly emerging field. This area. I mean, nature. I mean, obviously, psychedelics are having their kind of second wave. Their modern renaissance. But even that's fairly early days, relatively speaking. And nature connectedness research itself is sort of, I would say, it's been going in earnest for about 20 years, but much of it has been going on in the last few years. So where the two Venn diagrams of psychedelics and nature connectedness overlap is it's fairly niche still, um, but it is sort of growing. I'm involved with two studies now. So one on ayahuasca usage in an indigenous shamanic led like context in the Peruvian Amazon. So that's sort of a collaboration that's ongoing, but in its kind of we're just waiting for the follow up data now. And then in collaboration with Imperial, I think the most rigorous study looking at this so far conducted on psilocybin's effect on nature connectedness. And this, unlike the research that's done before, it will have a really good sample size. It will have a control group, placebo control, and it will have two different populations. So a healthy population and then a clinical population of people having psilocybin for major depression. So I feel like I'm sort of I think we're waiting on a Never study paper to be published first or submitted first before we can submit this one. But I'm excited to hopefully get that submitted quite soon, because I feel like it's going to be hopefully quite an important step forward to this field. And then it would be great to see some more research happen here. I feel like at this point in time, nature-based settings haven't really been part of the research story. I was involved with a survey study with Imperial, a paper called "From Egoism to Ecoism," which is also open access and online. And we did sort of assess people's access to nature, but because it was a survey study, we could only ask them, did you have access to nature for your psychedelic experience? Did you feel it had an important effect? And we got a sort of positive result that people who had access to nature-based settings during their experience did show an increase in nature connectedness more than those who didn't have access to nature. But we were only going on people's words. So those nature-based settings could vary from anything from like, a little patch of green to like full-on sort of wilderness and everything in between. So what needs to happen now to make this more rigorous is research needs to be conducted, I think, where there's control over the nature-based settings that people have access to, so we can kind of keep that standardized and controlled. um, so yeah, hopefully there will be more work in the pipeline will be happening.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you for your contribution to this emerging field, the Venn diagram overlap as it is. And
Thank you.
yeah, because these sound like fantastic directions in which to take the research. And so we will definitely, hopefully have you back on and tell us the latest findings of when your next
That would
research comes
be
out.
that would be great. I feel like I can't I feel like I can't say too much. I'm just playing it safe because I think I can be a bit of a
Fair.
blabbermouth
Yeah.
sometimes. And um
Yeah.
yeah, but no, that would be great because there are some exciting, compelling findings, and it'd be nice to share them once they're published.
Well, fantastic. Open invitation, Sam. Well,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you coming on and sharing everything with us and the listeners.
Thank you for having me.
We truly appreciate it. And for everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Plant Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating or review. It helps other people find the show. And if you'd like to find out more about plant medicine, including the show notes from today's episode, please head over to plantmedicine.org. The music for the Plant Medicine Podcast is by the incredible Porangi. If you'd like to check out his music, please find him at porangi.com or on social media at PORANGUI.